Okay, last video for today. So this video is going to be covering chapters 9 through 12, hitting on some of the key things from those chapters. So let's go ahead and start with chapter 9. So if you look on page 239, so the first thing that I want you to realize is what Sidney Carton actually gains. So what he has gained from talking with Solomon Prost, who essentially has a key to the prison. If you look in the middle of page 239, he says, "If it should go ill with the prisoner, I have ensured access to him once." So what Carton tells Mr. Lorry is that if something goes poorly with Charles Darnay, that Sidney Carton has at least managed to get access to him once. Obviously, that's nothing special, which Mr. Lorry reflects in his countenance. It says Mr. Lorry's countenance fell. And so Sidney basically says, well, it's all I could do. John Barsad knew if he gave me any other alternative that he could also still end up dead. So this is the best he could do without risking his life too much. And so we know that Sidney Carton has procured the opportunity to basically enter and see Charles Darnay once. Why that's significant, we will find out. But then moving forward in chapter 9, look on page 243. So we also know that Sidney Carton goes to a chemist. And what he gets at the chemist is unknown, but the chemist says to him, he says, "You will be careful to keep them separate, citizen. You know the consequences of mixing them." And Carton says, "Certainly." And so while he's walking after the chemist, he remembers this phrase, this saying from his father's funeral. And so this is obviously, right, reflection of the Bible, but it says, I'm the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. And so again, right, we're getting this theme of resurrection now, of course, seeming to reference the Bible, but Sidney Carton seems to remember this at this interesting period and time in his life while he has just procured access to see Darnay once. He has blackmailed to get that access. Oh, by the way, he's also gone to a chemist. And then in the next part of chapter 9, we are taken to the actual jury, and we see Charles Darnay being put on trial again for a second time. So if you look on the bottom of page 245, this is supposedly why he's being convicted. It says, "Charles Evrémonde called Darnay, released yesterday, reaccused and retaken yesterday. Indictment delivered to him last night, suspected and denounced enemy of the Republic, aristocrat, one of a family of tyrants, one of a race proscribed, for that they had used their abolished privileges to the infamous oppression of the people. Charles Evrémonde called Darnay, in right of such prescription, absolutely dead in law." And so essentially, exactly what we said earlier, he is purely being denounced for his ties to his family name. Even though he himself has done nothing wrong, everything linked to his family is essentially why he's on trial. And so now is the fascinating part when we find out, okay, so who actually is putting him on trial? So we already had the two witnesses, which we found out last chapter. So Mr. and Mrs. Defarge. And then, wait for it, shocker, on the top of page 246, it says, "And who is the third? Alexander Manette, physician." And then, of course, we read that there was a great uproar, and Dr. Manette is seen pale and trembling, and he says, "President, I absolutely protest. This is not true. This is not legitimate." Well, of course, Defarge comes up to the stand, and he says, "No, actually, it is true." He says, "I have a letter from that prisoner, from Dr. Manette, denouncing Charles Darnay and the entire Evrémonde family." And so if you look on page 247, this is exactly what he tells everyone. He says, let's see, "I knew the prisoner of whom I speak had been confined in a cell known as 105 North Tower." And if you recall, that's how Dr. Manette first introduced himself when he was at the top of the wine shop when Lucy and Mr. Lorry came to see him. He called himself, his name was 105 North Tower. So that was his cell in the Bastille. And so Defarge says, I knew it from himself. He knew himself by no other name than 105 North Tower. And so essentially he goes on and he says, I have found in a hole in the chimney, he says, a written paper. And basically, if you can imagine him holding it up, he says, this is that written paper. And so the president says, let it be read. So essentially what happens now in chapter 10 is this entire letter that Dr. Manette supposedly wrote all these years ago is now going to be read. And so first thing to consider, if you look on page 248, so this letter is supposedly dating back to 1757. And so if you look more recently, we are now in 1792. Let me make sure that's correct. I'm going to say 1792. If I'm off by a year, feel free to correct me. But all these years later, right? All these years later, finally this letter is now being read, even though what Dr. Manette is going to argue is it shouldn't stand. It shouldn't have any value at this point in time because he wrote it all those years ago. But essentially what we find in the letter is a horrific story of the Marquis and his family and how they took advantage of young children, of siblings. They raped a girl and all kinds of just horrible atrocities. And they're referred to as patients by Dr. Manette in the letter because Dr. Manette was called last second to try and save them. And anyways, obviously the young boy dies and the doctor is told not to say anything about the situation. So Dr. Manette is told not to say anything. But then later the woman dies as well. And so we find out on page 256 that there was a young lady, the wife of Marquis Saint Evremond, and then moving to page 257, the wife of the Marquis has a young son named Charles Darnay. So even though Charles Darnay's father and uncle were the sole people responsible for these atrocities, he is now being convicted. And so, let's see, if you continue on, it basically explains how Dr. Manette was imprisoned because, the assumption is that the aristocracy didn't want him to tell the truth about what they had done, and so therefore he was imprisoned. And happy prisoner, do this last night of the year 1767, in my unbearable agony, denounce to the times when all these things shall be answered for. I denounce them to heaven and to earth. And so essentially what he's saying here is I denounce the entire Evremond family, everything that's ever happened with them. It was horrific and they should pay, right? That family should pay. And so essentially everyone votes unanimously that Darnay should be killed. And don't miss that, actually I'm going to pause there for chapter 10 before we move on. And so, so they vote unanimously to kill Darnay. Then we move to chapter 11, and in chapter 11, Sidney Carton seems to say goodbye to Lucy's family here. And so I want you to make sure you recognize this, that Carton is valuable. So if you recall earlier on in book the second, Lucy talks to Charles Darnay and she says, remember that Sidney Carton is basically a good person. Like, I've seen the depths of his soul. He's not just this drunk that everyone makes him out to be. And so you see bits and pieces of that here on page 260. So little Lucy, Lucy's daughter, who of course has grown to love Carton over the years they've shared together, she says on the bottom of page 260, she says, "Oh, Carton, Carton, dear Carton." She says, "Now that you have come, I think you will do something to help Mama, something to save Papa. Oh, look at her, dear Carton. Can you, of all the people who love her, bear to see her so?" And so, in return to this question by Lucy's child, who says, "Please, can you do something to help my mom and my dad?" he bends over and he says, he kind of gives her a kiss, and he says one thing. But Dickens is brilliant here. He gives us some foreshadowing, and it says, "It was remembered afterwards that when he, Carton, bent down and touched her face meaning little Lucy, her face with his lips, he murmured some words. The child, who was nearest to him, told them afterwards, and told her grandchildren when she was a handsome old lady, that she heard him say, 'A life you love.'" Now, Hopefully you caught this when you were reading this. Remember what Carton told Lucy when he confessed his love to her. He said, I would do anything for you, even for you to keep a life you love beside you. So some foreshadowing there for sure. And so then we move to chapter 12, and in chapter 12, Carton goes into the Defarges wine shop, and they kind of freak out because they're like, oh my gosh, you look just like Charles Darnay, right? And we find out on page 264 why Madame Defarge is so vengeful, why she is filled with such hate for Charles Darnay and is showing zero mercy. This is on the bottom of page 264. We find out that she was family, that she was the sister, she was family of the family that was killed by the Marquise, and so by the Marquis family. And so essentially she's the last remaining family, and she is now seeking revenge for everything they did to her family. And so we get this repetition of this phrase on 264 and 265, where she says, tell the wind and fire where to stop, but don't tell me. So she tells her husband, look, I'm not stopping until I get full revenge. And then moving into 265, we have what we were afraid would happen, which is that Dr. Manette has gone into a relapse. And so if you remember, Dr. Manette said he was not going to, when he was having this conversation back with Mr. Lorry, he said a relapse wouldn't happen unless some incredibly strong, painful memory triggered it. And of course, what triggers it is now realizing that his son-in-law is, because of him, going to be put to death. And so on page 265, it says, towards the bottom of page 265, the instant he entered the room, it was plain that all was lost. He comes in and he says, I cannot find it. I must have it. Where is it? He says, where is my bench? I have been looking everywhere for my bench and I can't find it. What have they done with my work? Time presses. I must finish those shoes. And so obviously devastating here. Dr. Manette has relapsed into the person he was all those years ago. And he is looking for his tools and his bench. And so then the last thing from this chapter, from chapter 12, chapter 12. Hopefully I said the right number. I'm afraid I said 11, but we're still in chapter 12. And so, anyways, the last two things from chapter 12. So we find out that Madame Defarge, she has been keeping tabs on Lucy. So not only is she wanting Darnay to be killed because he's linked to the Evremond family, but she wants Lucy to suffer too. She wants anyone in conjunction with that family to be miserable because she and her family suffered. And so if you look on page 267, she's essentially telling, she's trying to get the wood sawyer, the tradesman, to convict Lucy. And so what she says, we're told that they're in danger of Madame Defarge. And so it says, he knows that a wood sawyer living by the prison walls under the control of the Defarges and has been rehearsed by Madame Defarge as to his having seen her making signs and signals to prisoners. It is easy to foresee that the pretense will be the common one, a prison plot, and that it will involve her life and perhaps her child's and perhaps her father's, for both have been seen with her at that place. And so essentially, right, so the idea here is that Madame Defarge is going to try and get all of them killed or at least imprisoned for standing out in that spot outside the prison. And obviously all Lucy ever did was just stand there. She couldn't ever even see Darnay, but Madame Defarge is going to try and get this tradesman, this wood sawyer, to lie and say that she was making signals to the prison and or the prisoner, right, trying to set up some kind of escape or something. Even though none of that was ever true, with the current mindset of the revolutionaries, that is certainly going to fly. That'll certainly be believable, and the idea is that she will be convicted. And so Carton realizes he has to do something to save all of them. And so he gives these travel papers to Mr. Lorry for Lucy and her daughter and their family and says, you guys have to leave tomorrow. He says, for any reason, don't stay behind. And so the last line on page 268, it says, before he went away, he breathed a blessing towards it meaning the window of Lucy's room, and a farewell, farewell with a capital F. And so, in some respects, it seems like Carton is saying goodbye to Lucy. Now, whether he actually is, we will find out. You have to read the last 3 chapters of the book, chapters 13 through 15. This is the closure to an incredible story, so please read them closely, read them carefully, and we'll talk about them on Friday. Okay, that is it.